It was a chilly October evening when Marcus drove along the stretch of highway that ran through the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a dull, bruised purple, the clouds low and heavy with the promise of rain. His truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the occasional twisted tree and abandoned farmhouse, each one more decrepit than the last. He had been driving for hours, returning from a long weekend in New Jersey, and the monotony of the road was making his eyelids heavy. Marcus shook his head, trying to stay alert. He had always been a night driver, but this particular stretch of road had a reputation, something he remembered from local news stories he had stumbled upon online, a series of disappearances, strange sightings, and accidents that no one could quite explain. Most of it seemed sensationalized, he told himself. But tonight, alone and tired, the stories crept into his mind. A small, uneasy knot formed in his stomach as he pressed the accelerator slightly, eager to put distance between himself and the old, crumbling towns he had been passing. About 20 miles down the road, a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. He slammed the brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. A figure, pale and thin, stepped into the road, holding what looked like a small lantern. Marcus's heart thumped hard. He tried to maneuver around it, but the figure didn't move, standing rigid as if it was carved out of stone. With a gulp, Marcus rolled down his window. "Hey, are you okay?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty night. The figure lifted its head slowly. Its face, though obscured by shadows, seemed wrong. Its eyes were hollow, black, reflecting nothing of the truck's headlights. Marcus's hand instinctively reached for the door lock. Before he could react further, the figure whispered, a voice that seemed to scrape across the edges of his mind, "Don't look behind you." The words froze him. His heart felt like it had stopped, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. Before he could ask what it meant, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness at the edge of the road. Shaking, Marcus accelerated, his pulse racing. Every shadow along the roadside now seemed to move, to slither toward him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following him. By the time he reached the next town, a sparse collection of houses and a gas station barely lit, he was trembling. He pulled into the station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Inside, a young attendant glanced at him with mild curiosity. "Long drive?" she asked, her voice flat, distracted. "Yeah, just needed a break," Marcus muttered, trying to steady his voice. He filled the tank and bought a bottle of water, grateful for the mundanity of the act. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, light at first, then heavier, hammering the hood of his truck. He shook his head, wishing he had taken the other route home, one that avoided these back roads entirely. But it was too late for that now. The road stretched out before him, glistening under the truck's headlights. As he drove, the rain intensified, and the isolation became palpable. It was then he noticed the sound, footsteps. Light, deliberate, keeping pace with the truck. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. No car, no person, just the empty, slick road disappearing into the darkness. The sound persisted, a subtle, rhythmic tap, always just behind him. Marcus's breathing quickened. He tapped the horn, glancing over his shoulder, but the noise had no effect. His rational mind argued that it was just the rain, his tires splashing against puddles, but a deeper, primal fear told him otherwise. The tap, tap, tap continued, insistent, echoing in the cab, like someone walking directly behind him on the roof. Suddenly, his headlights caught a movement in the distance. Another figure, tall and unnaturally thin, emerged from the tree line. Its arms hung awkwardly, swinging slightly as it walked. It had no face, or perhaps any semblance of one had been stripped away. Marcus's hands shook as he fumbled for the wheel, swerving slightly. The figure stepped to the side but did not retreat, keeping pace, walking as if the asphalt beneath it didn't exist. A scream caught in Marcus's throat. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, the tires spinning, hydroplaning over rain-slick pavement. The sound of the footsteps stayed with him, relentless. In a panic, he took the next turn, a sharp left into a narrower road that wound into the woods. Branches scraped against the truck, scratching metal, but he didn't care. He needed to get away. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror again, the figure was there, impossibly close, moving alongside the truck as though floating. His mind reeled. It couldn't be real, he kept telling himself. None of this could be real. and yet it was. The air inside the cab felt thick, like something pressed against his skin, watching, waiting. Marcus fumbled for his phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The forest around him grew darker, the rain now a torrent, blurring everything. And then the figure vanished, just like that. Marcus slowed down, chest heaving, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. But then he saw the signs, tire tracks in the mud along the roadside. They weren't his, and they led directly from the place where the figure had disappeared. Cold dread filled him. Something had been walking beside him. Something had been keeping pace, and now it had left a mark. He pressed on, taking the winding road until it spat him out onto a familiar stretch near his home. Relief flooded him, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe. But as he pulled into his driveway, headlights cutting across the familiar siding of his house, he froze. There, on the hood of his truck, were the footprints, small, narrow, and impossibly deep for their size, leading from the back to the windshield. Marcus's hands shook uncontrollably. He ran inside, locking every door and window, refusing to look outside again that night. Sleep did not come. Every creak, every groan of the house sounded amplified, deliberate, like someone or something was moving just beyond his vision. At 3 a.m, a tapping sound began at his bedroom window. He froze, heart hammering. Slowly, he turned his head. There, pressed against the glass, was the figure. Its face was still featureless, a blank canvas, but he could feel the intent behind it, the hunger, the awareness. Marcus dared not breathe. And then, as if satisfied, it tilted its head and vanished. Just like that, into the night. The next day, Marcus tried to convince himself it had been a dream, a hallucination fueled by exhaustion and stress. He researched the area, and what he found chilled him further. Stories of disappearances, of people reporting strange figures on the road at night, some even vanishing entirely. And many spoke of a road, the old Holloway, cursed, haunted, where travelers saw things that defied reason. Some claimed it was the spirit of someone who had died in a crash decades ago, forever wandering the stretch of highway, seeking company in their misery. Others whispered of something far older, something that had always been there, just beyond perception, feeding on fear. Weeks passed, but Marcus's fear did not. He avoided driving at night whenever possible, and the thought of that road made him sick to his stomach. Yet the footsteps persisted, not in reality, but in his dreams. Each night he would hear them approaching, the tap, tap, tap on rain-soaked asphalt, slow and deliberate, always keeping pace. The figure would appear at the edge of the dream, faceless, featureless, yet filled with purpose. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it didn't, but it never left. Months later, Marcus's friends convinced him to take a short road trip, a chance to push past his fear to reclaim control. Against his better judgment, he agreed, driving down familiar highways and then, inevitably, that cursed stretch of road. The night was clear, the sky free of rain, but the sense of dread returned instantly. His headlights illuminated nothing unusual, and he told himself he was imagining things. But the tapping started again, soft at first, then louder, insistent. He glanced in the mirror. Nothing. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. Then the figure appeared on the side of the road, not walking, but standing, watching, unmoving. This time, Marcus didn't stop. He drove faster, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, hoping to outrun it. But the tapping followed him inside the truck. He could feel it, like vibrations under the seat, a heartbeat not his own. Panicked, he made a sharp turn, tires screeching, nearly losing control. The figure stayed at the edge of his vision, always there, gliding alongside, unbound by the laws of reality. Marcus could feel it pressing into his mind now, a silent scream in his head, a gnawing, relentless presence. He didn't notice the turn he missed until the truck skidded off the road, flipping into the ditch. Pain exploded in his body, but the first thing he saw when he tried to move was the figure, standing over him, motionless. It tilted its head, and for a moment, Marcus thought it might vanish, but it didn't. It just watched, and then slowly, it raised one thin, elongated hand and touched his forehead. Everything went black. When Marcus woke, he was alone, the truck a mangled wreck in the ditch, the road empty, silent. The rain had started again, cold and relentless. He staggered to his feet, looking for help, but there was none. The world felt different, quieter, heavier, and in the periphery of his vision he swore he could see movement. Shadows that didn't belong, stretching, twisting, always watching. The sound returned too, the faint, insistent tap, tap, tap coming from all around him now. Marcus tried to reach the nearest town, but the roads twisted unnaturally, leading him in circles. It was then he realized the horrifying truth. The figure didn't just haunt the road, it followed him, always. He could feel it in the air, in the rain, in the shadows of the trees. Every step, every movement, it was there, just beyond perception, patient, watching, waiting. Days turned to weeks. Marcus never made it home. Search parties found the truck eventually, but he was gone. The ditch was empty, save for deep, narrow footprints pressed into the mud, leading from the wreck into the dense forest. Authorities speculated about abduction, an accident, maybe even foul play, but none could explain the footprints or the reports from locals who claimed to see a pale, faceless figure along the highway. Months later, travelers passing through that stretch of road would sometimes report seeing a truck, abandoned, lights flickering, and a figure standing nearby, silent, unmoving. Some said it held a lantern. Others said it didn't need one. And all of them whispered the same thing. If you hear the tapping, don't look behind you. The road remains, the forest remains, and the figure waits, patient, unrelenting, feeding on fear, unseen yet ever present. Marcus's story became another warning, another disappearance, another whisper in the growing myth of Old Holloway. But those who knew the truth understood one thing. It wasn't just a road, and it wasn't just a ghost. It was something older, something that had always been there, lying in wait, keeping pace with anyone foolish enough to travel its stretch after dark. Even now, long after the wreck, the footprints appear on the rain-soaked asphalt, always leading forward, always vanishing into the darkness. Travelers report a presence, a cold weight on their shoulders, a tapping just behind them that never ceases. And if you stop, if you look behind, it's there. Faceless, featureless, patient, waiting. Always waiting. No one knows what happens to those it touches. Some vanish, some return, changed, hollow, eyes empty. And some, if you're unlucky, hear the tap, tap, tap in their own homes, following them, stretching through walls and floors, across distances, a relentless reminder that the road and its watcher never truly ends. Marcus's story is not unique. There are hundreds like it, scattered across the country, tales of faceless figures, of footsteps in the dark, of roads that twist time and space, trapping travelers in loops of fear and desperation. The evidence is anecdotal, dismissed by skeptics, but the consistency of the accounts suggests something more, something beyond understanding, something patient, something that feeds, something that waits. No one truly knows how to stop it. People disappear, houses are abandoned, towns whisper warnings, but the road remains, the figure remains, and the tapping never stops. And somewhere, in the rain, in the dark, in the shadows, it waits. Story, the end. It was one of those nights where the rain seemed to come down not in sheets, but in walls, drumming against the asphalt like some monstrous percussion. The city was quiet, almost eerily so, save for the occasional siren or the sound of a car splashing through a puddle. I had just left my office late, later than usual, thanks to a project that had gone off the rails, and I was grateful that the streets were mostly empty. The storm had kept most people indoors, and I was alone, driving through the darkened city in my old, beat-up sedan. The office had been unnervingly empty when I finally packed up. My coworkers, normally the last to leave, were gone hours earlier. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe they had families to get home to, or maybe they were just tired of the project as much as I was. The rain, however, felt different. There was something about the way it bounced off the buildings that made it sound almost like whispered laughter, like the storm itself was alive and mocking me. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off, and started my car. The engine sputtered before finally roaring to life, and I pulled out onto the slick streets. I had no particular destination in mind. My apartment was several miles away, a grimy studio on the east side, and I was looking forward to a shower and a quiet night. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The streets were mostly empty, but every now and then I caught glimpses of figures moving just at the edge of the streetlights. I told myself it was my imagination, that shadows played tricks in the storm, but the feeling lingered. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, but there was nothing. just the reflection of my own tired eyes and the rain streaking across the glass. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I turned onto a side street I didn't recognize. I had driven this way countless times, but suddenly the familiar landmarks seemed off, as if the city had shifted while I wasn't looking. The old bakery on the corner was boarded up. The streetlights flickered and buzzed like dying insects, and there was a pungent smell in the air, something metallic and sour. I frowned and slowed my car, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw the first figure, standing at the end of the street, completely still. At first, I thought it was a pedestrian waiting for the light, but as I got closer, I realized that it was facing me, completely motionless, and too thin, too elongated, like it had been stretched by some cruel hand. I blinked and it was gone. I shook my head again, telling myself I was just tired, that the storm and the late hour were playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't leave. I took the next turn, hoping to get back to a main road, and that's when the car behind me appeared. At first, I didn't notice it until it started matching my every turn, no matter which street I took. I tried to lose it, weaving through alleys and back streets, but it stayed behind, silent and unblinking. The headlights reflected off the rain, making the car look almost like a specter. I didn't dare slow down, and every instinct told me that if I did, it would be over. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a stretch of highway and forced myself to take a deep breath. The car didn't follow. Relief washed over me, but it was brief. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I realized the figure was sitting in the back seat of my own car. I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering, and spun around. The back seat was empty. My pulse was racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I wanted to call someone, but my phone was dead. The battery drained faster than I remembered. That's when I realized I wasn't just being followed, I was being hunted. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a prank, a lunatic in the storm, but nothing made sense. The car that had been following me was gone. My rearview mirror showed nothing but rain and asphalt. I kept driving, pushing forward, trying to put distance between myself and the unseen terror. The city had started to change again. Buildings loomed closer, shadows seemed thicker, and every street lamp flickered in a rhythm that made my stomach churn. Then I saw it. A man, or what looked like a man, standing in the middle of the highway, completely still, facing me. I swerved, narrowly missing him, and the figure didn't move. It simply watched as I passed, and I swear I heard a low, guttural laugh over the sound of the rain. I pulled off at the next exit, desperate to get to someplace familiar. The signs pointed to suburbs I didn't recognize, houses that looked abandoned and lawns overgrown with weeds. I slowed my car, trying to find a familiar landmark, but everything was wrong. Mailboxes were crooked, cars sat rusting in driveways, and there was a sense of oppressive silence, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. That's when I noticed movement in the windows. Not people, but shapes. Shadowy figures standing at the edge of the curtains, staring. I counted at least a dozen houses, all of them occupied by silent watchers. I felt my throat tighten, the air in my car thickening like molasses. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. I turned back onto the main road, hoping to find a highway or a familiar intersection. That's when I saw the car again. It wasn't behind me this time, it was in front, crawling along, headlights off, like it was gliding through the rain. I tried to overtake it, but no matter what I did, it stayed just ahead, never speeding up, never slowing down. I realized then that I had no control, no matter how hard I pressed the pedals. The car led me, and I had no choice but to follow. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn back, but the road twisted and warped, and soon I found myself somewhere I didn't recognize, somewhere that wasn't even on the map. The neighborhood gave way to an abandoned stretch of industrial warehouses. The rain poured down harder here, sheets of water cascading off the corrugated roofs. The car stopped abruptly in front of one of the warehouses, its engine idling silently. I slammed on the brakes and threw the door open, stepping into the storm. The cold hit me like a punch, but I didn't care. I needed to move, to escape. The car's doors opened silently behind me, and I just knew, that something was inside. I didn't wait to see it. I ran. The warehouse loomed over me, massive and decayed, its windows shattered and walls streaked with rust. I darted inside, hoping for cover, but the interior was vast and empty, echoing with my own frantic breaths. I could hear something moving above me, something sliding along the metal beams of the roof. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming. The sound grew closer, heavier, until I could feel the vibrations through the floor. Then I saw it. Shadows dancing along the walls, impossible shapes that stretched and bent in ways that defied physics. They moved with intent, watching, waiting. I turned to leave, but the doors were gone. The warehouse had transformed while I wasn't looking. Walls stretching higher, ceilings lower, passages twisting in impossible ways. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I ran blindly through the corridors, my hands brushing against wet, slimy surfaces. The smell of decay thick in my nostrils. I could hear whispers now, not from any one direction, but all around me, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. The shadows followed, slipping along walls, crawling across floors, closing in. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time didn't exist here. Every turn led to another dead end, every corridor mirrored the last. I screamed, but no sound came out. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The shadows were relentless, moving closer with every heartbeat. And then I saw it. A figure in the center of the room, taller than any human, impossibly thin, with eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. It raised an arm, and I felt my body convulse, my mind seizing with fear. Images flashed through my head, memories that weren't mine, faces twisted in pain, screams I could hear but couldn't escape. I collapsed to my knees, trembling, tears streaming down my face. The figure spoke, not with words but with thought, invading my mind. It told me I had been chosen, that I had seen too much, that the city had noticed me, that whatever followed me, whatever led me here, had marked me. I understood then that I wasn't being hunted. I was bait. And the car, the figures, the shadows, they had all been waiting, guiding me here. My fear was the trap, my mind the prey. I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying in my car again. The rain stopped, the streets empty. I checked my phone, fully charged, and tried to call someone, anyone, but the line was dead. The city looked normal, familiar, but something was off. I could feel it, a weight pressing against the edges of my perception, something that wasn't there before. I drove home in silence, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But the memories were too vivid, the fear too real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light made me jump. I checked the locks on my doors and windows over and over, but it didn't help. I could feel eyes on me, watching from just beyond my perception. And then the sound of tires on wet asphalt outside my building, slow, deliberate, circling, waiting. I opened the window, and there it was again, a car, headlights off, engine silent, sitting at the end of the street. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body froze. The driver's seat was empty. But I could see it, someone, something, inside. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was only the beginning. Whatever had hunted me that night was patient. It would wait, it would watch, and eventually it would come for me again. And next time, I would have no escape. Story the end. It was one of those late September evenings when the air hangs heavy with the smell of damp leaves, the kind that makes your skin tingle with the first hints of autumn. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of road that seems to vanish into the woods, narrow, two-lane, lined with dense trees so close together that streetlights barely penetrate. The rain had started an hour earlier, light, almost polite at first, but by the time I reached mile marker 23, it was pouring in earnest. The windshield wipers barely kept up with the sheets of water, and the orange glow from the old highway lamps barely reflected off the slick asphalt. I had the car stereo on, but the static from a weak signal made every song sound fractured, the voices cutting in and out. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, in a way, despite the storm. Only, I wasn't really alone. About 10 minutes into the stretch that I always called the Snake because of its winding curves through the forest, my headlights caught a figure standing at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, or maybe a deer frozen in the rain. But the shape was too upright, too human. I slowed down, heart thumping, trying to see if the person needed help. That's when I noticed the hooded coat, dark and dripping wet, covering someone completely. I rolled down my window despite the rain, yelling, "Hey, you okay?" The figure didn't move, just stood there, silent, staring. I could barely see a face under the hood, but something about the stillness made my stomach knot. I hesitated for a second. Then, being the kind of person who can't ignore someone in trouble, I pulled over. "Do you need a ride?" I called, stepping out into the rain. The water soaked through my jacket almost immediately, cold against my skin. The figure finally moved, but not like a normal person. The way they came toward me was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, like each step was calculated. When they got close enough, I noticed the gloves, black leather, wet and shiny. But it wasn't the gloves that unsettled me. It was the hands. They were impossibly thin, almost skeletal, and pale like bone beneath wet skin. "Please," the voice said, low, almost a rasp. Not quite human. I froze. Something in my gut screamed at me to run, to get back in my car and lock the doors. But the stranger's voice was weak, almost pleading. "Help me." Against my better judgment, I nodded and gestured for them to get in. As soon as the door shut, I noticed the smell. Wet earth, iron, and something else, something foul that made my stomach twist. I swallowed hard and tried to focus on the road. Where do you need to go?" I asked. My voice sounded louder than I intended over the rain. Just down the road. "Far enough," they whispered. I started the car, glancing at the rearview mirror. Their hood slipped back slightly, and I caught a glimpse of their eyes. They were completely black, no whites at all. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed the gas a little harder, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The stranger didn't speak again. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rain against the windshield and the occasional rumble of thunder. Every mile felt longer than the last, the trees pressing in closer, shadows twisting as if alive. I noticed something weird. The road signs were different. The mile markers weren't counting up. They were counting down. 22, 21, 20. That shouldn't have been possible. I had been driving for 10 minutes at least. I turned my head slightly to speak, but the stranger was staring straight ahead, expressionless, the blackness of those eyes reflecting the storm outside. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but where would I even go? The forest stretched endlessly, and the rain made it impossible to see beyond a few dozen feet. Suddenly, the stranger spoke again, whispering over my shoulder. "Do you see them?" "See? What?" I asked, voice trembling. "They're watching," the figure said. "All of them. Behind the trees, waiting." I glanced to the side, heart hammering, but all I saw were the wet trunks of oak and maple, shaking in the wind. Then I saw it. Movement. Shadows too large to be animals, moving between the trees. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, rain blurring the road. Who's watching us?" I stammered, panic making my words stumble. "They're hungry," the stranger said simply, almost like stating a fact, not a threat. "And we're trespassing." The road twisted violently, a sharp curve I hadn't noticed before. My tires slipped on the wet asphalt, and I almost skidded into the ditch. I gripped the wheel tightly, glancing at the mirror again. The eyes, black, endless, were still staring at me, but now I realized something worse. The hooded figure was smiling, a slow, deliberate smile that made my stomach lurch. Why are you smiling?" I asked, my voice cracking. "They always do this," they whispered. "They like to watch them run. You'll see soon enough." Before I could respond, the car went dark. Headlights, taillights, dashboard, all of it dead. Panic surged through me. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. Then I heard it. A low, guttural chanting, echoing from the trees, wet leaves rustling in a rhythm that didn't belong to nature. I couldn't see the shadows clearly now. They were moving faster, sliding between trees, circling. The air felt thick, heavy, and cold, and every instinct in me screamed to leave, but the car wouldn't start. "Get out," the stranger said softly, almost gently. "No, I can't," I shouted, fumbling with the keys. "They'll find us either way," the voice said. "Better you than me." Before I could argue, the door opened. I didn't understand at first. I was terrified to move, but then I realized the stranger wasn't stepping out. They were dissolving. Like smoke over embers, the body disintegrated into the mist, leaving nothing behind but that smile, they floating for a moment in the darkness. My blood ran cold. And then I heard it. The breathing. Not mine, not anyone I could see, but all around. Deep, wet, animalistic, yet eerily human. I spun the wheel, trying to drive forward, but the shadows had already filled the road. Figures, tall and thin like the stranger, moved with impossible speed, encircling the car. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't random. It was counting. Each word of the chant seemed to align with my heartbeat, which had risen to a rapid, chaotic rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. I tried the horn, anything to make them stop, but it sounded muffled, as if underwater. Then the windshield cracked, a single spiderweb fracture that spread across the glass, and I realized the shadows weren't just outside, they were inside too. Faces pressed against the glass from the interior, the black eyes staring, waiting, hungry. I don't remember what happened next exactly. I remember trying to escape, smashing the gear shift, the steering wheel, screaming so loud my throat burned. I remember the wet hands from the stranger, or was it all of them, gripping the doors, pulling me out. Then, darkness. I woke up later on the side of the road, soaked, muddy, car gone. The rain had stopped and the forest was silent. No shadows, no chanting, just the smell of wet earth and iron. My phone was in my hand. Battery dead, screen cracked. I called 911, and when the police arrived, they found nothing. No car, no figure, nothing in the trees. Just the empty road and a single set of tire tracks disappearing into the forest. I tried to tell people what happened. Friends, family, even my coworkers at the hospital. Some nodded politely, others laughed. "You fell asleep in the rain," one said. It was just a nightmare. But I knew better. I could still feel the black eyes on me when I closed my own, hear the chanting in the silence before sleep, smell the iron in the air. Weeks later, I found something else. A picture on my old disposable camera, the kind I sometimes keep in my car for emergencies. I hadn't taken it. The last thing I remember was fumbling with my phone. But there it was. A single photo, blurred by rain, of the stranger, or something that looked exactly like them, standing in the middle of the road, hands stretched out, smiling. And if you looked closely past the hood, you could see them. Rows of faces, black eyes pressed into the trees behind, watching. I quit driving at night. I changed shifts, moved closer to the hospital. But every time I pass that stretch of road in daylight, I feel it, like the trees themselves are alive, like the shadows remember me. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the whispering of that voice. They're hungry and we're trespassing. I don't know what they are. I don't know why they came for me or why the stranger chose to appear. But I know one thing, I've never been the same since that night. And every night, when the wind rustles the leaves just right, I swear I can hear them counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Story, the end. It started on a night that was colder than usual for early November in upstate New York. I was driving back from visiting my sister in Albany, taking the longer, scenic route home to my small apartment in the Catskills. The road was mostly empty, winding through dense forest that swallowed the light from my headlights. I had taken this route dozens of times before, but something about the stillness that night made the air feel heavier, as if it was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just fatigue, or maybe the wind howling through the trees playing tricks on my mind. About 30 miles from my exit, I noticed a figure standing at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but there was something wrong about the way it stood, motionless like it had been carved out of the shadows. I slowed down, squinting, and realized it was wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured by the hood. I didn't recognize it, and instinctively, I wanted to avoid stopping. But then I saw the arm. It was outstretched, pointing toward me, or maybe toward the road ahead. My stomach sank. I sped up instead, gripping the wheel tightly. The moment I passed the figure, a chill ran through my body, like an icy finger tracing my spine. For the next several miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The trees seemed to lean closer to the road, their branches scraping against the sides of my car. I tried to rationalize it, my imagination, tired eyes, paranoia. But every turn I made, every mile, I could swear I saw something fleeting in the rearview mirror, a shadow that wasn't mine. When I finally arrived at my apartment building, I thought the unease would dissipate. But it didn't. The building, a brick structure built in the late 70s, looked empty, almost abandoned. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals, a mix that gave me a headache. I unlocked my door, closed it behind me, and tried to shake off the lingering dread. The first night was restless. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of whispering. It wasn't loud, barely audible, and it seemed to come from inside my apartment. I told myself it was my neighbors, though the building was mostly empty. I tried to go back to sleep, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder. It didn't sound like words at first, just a soft, persistent murmur that made my skin crawl. The next day, I found something strange. My front door had a small scratch near the lock, as if someone or something had tried to force it open. I live alone, and there had been no one else in the building. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe a maintenance worker, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, and moving toward my apartment. I held my breath, heart pounding, but the steps stopped right outside my door. Then there was silence. I didn't sleep at all, sitting in the dark and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Over the next week, the disturbances escalated. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. A chair shifted slightly from one corner to another. My keys would vanish, only to appear on the kitchen counter, like far from where I had left them. Sometimes I would see shadows at the edge of my vision, flickering and twisting like they weren't bound by the room. I tried to leave one evening, hoping that driving somewhere else would calm my nerves. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that froze me in place. Footprints in the snow, leading from the road directly to my apartment door. They were too large to be human, and they stopped abruptly at my threshold, as if the owner had vanished. I called the local police to report the strange occurrences. They sent an officer, but he found nothing. "Old buildings play tricks on your mind," he said, giving me a skeptical look before leaving. I wanted to believe him, but the evidence was too persistent. Every night the noises grew more aggressive. Doors slammed open by themselves. I would hear someone breathing in the hallways, slow and deliberate, following me from room to room. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window open. I live on the second floor. It hadn't been open before. The curtains fluttered in the cold wind, but I saw something more terrifying. A figure crouched outside, motionless, watching me. Pale skin glinting in the moonlight, eyes black and hollow. I froze, unable to move until it slowly climbed down and disappeared into the woods behind the building. After that, I tried to leave again. I packed my car, intending to drive back to Albany and stay with my sister. But the moment I started the engine, it died. Dead battery. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. I was trapped. The following nights were worse. I began to see things inside the apartment. Shadows stretched and moved along the walls, independent of any light source. Sometimes I would wake to find figures standing in the corner of the room, motionless, watching. Their faces were featureless, smooth and pale, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and oppressive. I researched the building's history. Built in the late 1970s, there had been several incidents. Tenants reported hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and even disappearing under mysterious circumstances. One newspaper clipping mentioned a tenant found dead in his apartment, his face frozen in terror. The official cause of death was listed as unknown, though some locals whispered about a curse or restless spirits. As the nights wore on, sleep became impossible. Every shadow, every creak of the floor made my heart race. I began to notice patterns in the disturbances. They seemed to intensify whenever I was alone, every sound amplified, every shadow more pronounced. Sometimes I would see the same figure from the window outside, standing at the end of the hallway, waiting. I started documenting everything, videos, audio recordings, photographs. But whenever I reviewed them, the footage was incomplete or corrupted. Shadows appeared in strange angles, and the figures seemed blurred, impossible to define. The whispering was always there, though, a constant presence in every recording. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door slowly creaking open. I held my breath, paralyzed. The shadow in the doorway was taller than any human, limbs bent at impossible angles, featureless face staring directly at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow moved closer, gliding across the floor without making a sound, and I felt a cold pressure pressing into my chest. The next morning, I found scratches along the walls of my bedroom, deep and jagged, as if something had clawed its way inside. The marks were fresh, despite no one else having access to the apartment. I began to feel sick, physically and mentally, like the presence was feeding off my fear. Desperate, I contacted a paranormal investigator. He came the next week, a middle-aged man with years of experience. He brought equipment, EMF meters, cameras, and a small crucifix, muttering about residual energy and entities attached to locations. We spent hours in the apartment, and the readings were off the charts. EMF spikes, temperature drops, unexplainable sounds. He even caught a figure on infrared camera, standing in the hallway, turning its head to look directly into the lens. He told me bluntly that the entity was not bound to the building. It had latched onto me, following me wherever I went. "You've been marked," he said. "It's patient, it waits, and it doesn't forget. Distance won't help." I didn't believe him at first, but the following weeks confirmed his warning. No matter where I moved, I felt it. Shadows at the edge of my vision, doors moving on their own, whispers in the dead of night calling my name. I stopped going out after dark. I avoided social contact. Friends called, but I couldn't answer. I began to lose touch with reality. One evening, I awoke to a sound that froze me. Footsteps in my bedroom, heavy, deliberate, moving toward me. I sat up, paralyzed, and saw the figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was taller than the ceiling, limbs contorted, face blank, and pale. Its presence pressed down on me, suffocating like a physical weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. The air was thick with a cold that burned my lungs. I tried to leave, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow reached for me, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like ice cutting through flesh. The last thing I remember before blacking out was its whisper, clear and deliberate. "You belong to me now." When I came to, I was outside my apartment, lying on the sidewalk. Neighbors had called an ambulance. I was incoherent, trembling, and when they asked what happened, I couldn't explain. I didn't even want to. Months passed. I moved again, this time across the country, hoping distance would matter. But the presence didn't leave. It followed me into new apartments, new towns, always there at night, always at the edge of my vision. I tried everything, therapy, medication, even spiritual rituals. Nothing worked. It was patient, unyielding, a shadow that existed outside of time, feeding off my fear, waiting for me to falter. I've lost friends. I've lost sleep. I've lost the ability to trust my own mind. And I know with a certainty that chills me to the bone that one day it will make full contact. One day it will reach out and there will be nothing left of me to resist. If you ever feel a presence behind you when you're alone, if shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't, if whispers call your name in the dead of night, run. Don't look back. Don't answer. Because if it marks you, it will never let go. And when it comes for you, there will be no hiding, no escape, no end. All I can do now is write this, a warning, a record, a desperate plea to anyone who might listen. I am still here, but only barely. And I know it's only a matter of time before I am not. Story the end. The night had settled over the outskirts of rural Kentucky, heavy and still, with the occasional cry of a distant owl punctuating the silence. Greg had been driving for hours, the endless stretches of highway stretching into nothingness, lit only by the dim glare of his headlights reflecting off the slick asphalt. He was on his way home after visiting his sister in Louisville, a trip he had postponed for months, and the weariness of the long drive had begun to seep into his bones. His eyes kept drifting shut, forcing him to blink repeatedly, trying to stay alert. The rhythm of the tires on the road hypnotic and unrelenting. He noticed it first as a shadow in the rearview mirror, subtle and fleeting, just a flicker at the edge of his vision. He swore it was a trick of the headlights on wet pavement, a reflection bouncing off a curve, but the unease that prickled the back of his neck refused to leave. Greg shook his head, muttering to himself, trying to shake the creeping dread and focused on the road. Yet the feeling persisted, a low, persistent sense of being watched. About 30 miles down the road, he saw a figure standing by the side of the highway. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, a man with a dark jacket and a hood pulled up, standing perfectly still. Greg slowed, instinctively cautious. He wasn't opposed to picking up strangers, but something about the way the figure stood, rigid, unnaturally still, made him uneasy. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He slowed to a near stop and rolled down the window. "Hey, you need a ride?" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't move. Its head tilted slightly, almost mechanically. Then it raised an arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed down the road ahead. Its face was obscured by the hood, but Greg could feel eyes on him, cold and unyielding, the sort of gaze that made your stomach sink and your chest tighten. A whisper reached him, carried faintly by the wind. "Don't stop! Don't look back." Greg swallowed hard, unease coiling in his chest like a live thing. He forced himself to accelerate, heart hammering. The figure didn't move aside, didn't vanish. It remained on the shoulder of the highway, watching him. As he drove past, he caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched impossibly tight, like clay molded over bone. Shaking, Greg kept driving, willing himself to convince that this was just fatigue, a trick of shadows in the headlights. But the feeling of being followed intensified. He could hear it in the hum of the tires over the wet asphalt, a subtle rhythm not in sync with the road, something irregular, something alive. The hair on his arms stood up, and he found his hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The road narrowed as it twisted through a dense stretch of forest. Rain began to fall, at first in light droplets that spattered against the windshield, then in heavy sheets that had hammered the roof of his car. Visibility dropped to a few feet ahead, and Greg's heart pounded as he squinted through the wipers. And then, in a flash, something darted across the road, a figure, impossibly thin, moving with unnatural speed, passing from one side to the other in a single stride. Greg slammed on the brakes. His tires skidded, the truck fishtailing slightly, and he cursed under his breath, trying to regain control. When he looked in the rearview mirror, his stomach sank. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road behind him, motionless, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated in a grotesque way. Greg blinked, rubbed his eyes, and blinked again, but it didn't move, didn't need to. It was enough that it existed. The rational part of his brain screamed at him, "Drive, get out of here, this isn't real." But another part of him, a more primitive part, knew better. He was not alone. He never had been alone. The forest around him seemed to constrict, the rain muffling the world, turning the trees into looming, silent watchers. He pressed the accelerator, forcing the truck forward, tires hydroplaning on the slick surface. Hours seemed to pass. Every time he glanced in the mirror, there it was. Not always in the same place, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always watching. Greg tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by fatigue, stress, and rain. But nothing felt hallucinatory, except the sickening realization that he could not escape. Eventually, the road opened into a small town, dimly lit, the streets slick and empty. Greg pulled into a gas station, desperate for any sign of normalcy. The attendant, a teenage girl with a vacant expression, barely glanced at him as he filled the tank. He fumbled for change, trying to make casual conversation, but the words caught in his throat. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, but the sense of being followed remained. He noticed that the air felt thicker here, heavier, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked just beyond the periphery of his vision. Greg forced himself to drive again, taking the highway that would eventually lead him home. But the terror followed him, a living, breathing entity clinging to the edges of his perception. And then, without warning, his headlights caught another figure at the side of the road. This one was closer, its outline clearer. Like the first, it was unnervingly thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The skin of its face was pale, featureless, smooth. Greg's stomach churned, bile rising as he instinctively looked away, forcing himself to keep driving. The sound began then, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate echoing in the cab of his truck. It didn't come from outside or from the tires, it came from within. Greg's pulse hammered in his ears. He looked around desperately, but the cab was empty. The sound persisted. Tap, 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 and with every tap, he felt a weight pressing into his chest, making it hard to breathe. By the time he reached the familiar outskirts of his neighborhood, Greg was trembling, beads of sweat mixing with the rain on his forehead. Relief should have washed over him, but it didn't. When he pulled into his driveway, the headlights revealed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints, narrow and impossibly deep for their size, were pressed into the wet grass leading from the edge of the road to the front of his house. Greg ran inside, locking every door and window, refusing to look outside again. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house sounded amplified, deliberate. At 3 a.m, a tapping sound began at the bedroom window. Greg froze, paralyzed with fear. Slowly, he turned his head, and there it was, standing just beyond the glass, head tilted, featureless face unblinking. It didn't move, didn't need to. Greg could feel its intent, its awareness pressing into his mind, and then, as silently as it had arrived, it vanished. Days turned to weeks. Greg never fully recovered. He avoided driving at night, his anxiety mounting with every passing hour, and yet the tapping persisted, not in reality, but in his dreams. Each night it returned, insistent, deliberate. The figure would appear at the edge of his vision, faceless and featureless, patient and unrelenting. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it didn't, but it never left. Months later, his friends convinced him to take a short road trip, a chance to reclaim control. Against his better judgment, he agreed. They drove past familiar highways, and inevitably that cursed stretch of forest. The night was clear, no rain to obscure vision, but the sense of dread returned instantly. Greg's pulse accelerated. He could feel it before he saw it. Then, as they rounded a bend, the figure emerged from the shadows, gliding alongside the car. Greg's hands shook violently on the wheel. He tried to accelerate, tried to force the car past it, but it kept pace effortlessly, its form unbound by reality. The tapping returned, now inside the cab, beneath his feet, echoing in his skull. Panic overtook him, and he swerved sharply to avoid an imagined obstruction, tires screeching. The car went off the road, sliding down a ditch and rolling once before coming to rest against a tree. Pain exploded in every limb, but the first thing Greg saw when he tried to move was the figure, standing over him, unmoving. Its face was still featureless, and yet it radiated intent, a silent scream pressing into his mind. Slowly, impossibly, it raised one long, thin hand and touched his forehead. Darkness consumed him. When he awoke, he was alone. The car was a twisted wreck in the ditch. The road was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. Rain had returned, cold and relentless. Greg staggered to his feet, disoriented, looking for help. But the world felt different now. Heavier, quieter, unnatural. And in the periphery of his vision, he could see movement. Shadows stretching and twisting, unbound by logic. The tapping continued, faint and insistent, surrounding him. He never made it home. Search parties found the car eventually, but Greg was gone. Footprints, narrow and deep, led from the wreck into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. Authorities speculated, but none could explain the footprints or the reports of a faceless figure along that stretch of road. Travelers report seeing the figure standing beside the highway, lantern in hand or sometimes empty-handed, waiting. If you hear the tapping, the locals whisper, "Never look back." It is patient. It feeds. It follows. Years passed, stories spread, but the road remained. The figure remained. The tapping never stopped. Some travelers vanish. Some return, hollow and empty-eyed. And some, if unlucky, hear the tap, tap, tap in their own homes across miles, a reminder that it never truly leaves. No one knows how to stop it. No one knows what it wants. All they know is that it waits, always patient, always unrelenting. Somewhere in the shadows, in the rain, in the periphery of your vision, it watches. Always. Story the end. It started the night I decided to drive out to the old county road, the one that cuts through the forests outside of Gettysburg. I had always been drawn to isolation, the kind that made the rest of the world feel like a distant memory. I'd been driving late for weeks, nursing a restless itch in my chest I couldn't shake. That night, the sky was overcast, thick clouds blotting out the moon, and a drizzle had settled over the asphalt. My headlights barely cut through the mist, casting only pale rectangles of light on the road ahead. I was alone, save for the dull hum of the engine and the occasional static from the old car radio. About an hour in, I noticed something at the edge of the road, a figure. At first, I thought it was a tree or a road sign twisted in the wind, but as I approached, I realized it was human, standing perfectly still, shoulders slumped, arms at its sides like it was waiting for me. I slowed, heart thudding, squinting to see more clearly. The figure lifted its head. Even in the rain, I could see its face, pale, expressionless, eyes so dark I couldn't tell if they were open or not. There was something wrong about the way it stood, too rigid, too deliberate, as if it had been placed there rather than standing naturally. I pulled over, hesitation knotting my stomach. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. I opened my door. Rain immediately soaked my jacket, but I stepped toward it anyway. "You okay?" Finally, it spoke. The voice was low, almost a rasp. "I need a ride." I froze. I knew better than to pick up strangers on a road like this, especially at night, especially in a storm. But some part of me, a mixture of guilt and curiosity, compelled me to nod. I got back in the car and gestured for the figure to climb in. The instant it closed the door, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath fogging the windshield, even though the heater was on full. The stranger sat silently, hood pulled low, hands resting on its knees, long fingers draped like claws. My hands tightened on the wheel as I drove, trying to focus on the road ahead. Where are we going? I asked finally, my voice tight. Just down the road, it replied. Far enough. I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed that I was making a mistake. The car radio sputtered, the static spiking for a moment before going dead. The road twisted through the woods, and I began to notice something odd. The mile markers were counting down. I had passed 23 miles earlier, but now I saw 22, 21, 20. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been driving backward. I glanced at the figure. Its hood had slipped slightly, revealing pale, gaunt features. The eyes, black, empty, endless, stared straight ahead. My pulse accelerated, my knuckles turning white on the wheel. Who are you? I asked, though I already feared the answer. They're watching, the figure whispered. All of them, behind the trees, waiting. I glanced to the sides, and I thought I saw movement, shadows sliding between the trunks, too large to be animals. I pressed the gas, rain blurring the road into streaks of gray and black. Watching what? I asked, voice trembling. They like to see them run, it said. You'll see soon enough. The trees pressed closer, twisting, contorting. My headlights illuminated forms that didn't seem quite human, but weren't animals either. They moved just beyond the tree line, always at the edges of my vision. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind refused to let go of the shapes. They were tall, thin, limbs bent at impossible angles, faces with dark eyes and wide mouths, grinning. Then the stranger spoke again, low and calm. Get out! I shouted, panic surging. I can't! They'll find us anyway. Better you than me. I didn't understand what it meant until I saw the hand. Pale, skeletal fingers gripping the door, the same as the stranger's, but stretching impossibly long, sliding through the air like smoke. My instincts finally broke. I tried to reverse, tried to drive away, but the car wouldn't start. Every attempt failed, the engine refusing to turn over, the lights flickering. The shadows were closer now, forming a wall of black eyes, watching, waiting. I tried to scream, but the sound felt muffled, as if underwater. Then I felt it, a cold, wet presence pressing against my skin, creeping up my legs, climbing my arms. I tried to shake it off, but it was everywhere. The hooded figure wasn't beside me anymore. It was merging with the shadows, spreading, multiplying. I remember glimpses, the windshield cracking, the shadows pressing through the glass, faces pressed tight, mouths opening impossibly wide, whispering, chanting, counting. I tried the horn, tried the headlights, tried to move. Nothing worked. My body refused to obey. I was trapped. Then there was a moment of silence, deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The shadows receded. The hooded figure, or what had been the figure, stood in front of me, smiling, wide and calm, almost tender. Its hand touched my cheek, cold, wet, bone-deep cold. When I woke, I was on the side of the road, soaked, muddy, car gone. The storm had passed. The road stretched endlessly, silent, as if nothing had happened. No shadows, no chanting, nothing but wet leaves and the smell of iron. My phone, lying in the grass, was dead. The police arrived hours later. They found no car, no figure, nothing in the trees. Just the empty road, wet and shining in the moonlight, and tire tracks that disappeared into the forest. Friends and family tried to reassure me. You fell asleep. It was just a dream. It's stress. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't a dream. Weeks later, I found the disposable camera I kept in the glove compartment. I hadn't used it recently, and yet there was a single photograph developed from it. Blurred, rainy, a figure standing in the middle of the road. The hooded figure. But behind it, pressed into the trees, were dozens of faces. Dark eyes staring, mouths open in frozen grins. Since that night, I have never driven alone on that road. I avoid forests at night. I sleep with the lights on. But sometimes when the wind rustles the leaves outside my window, I hear it. Whispers, counting, watching, waiting. And I know that whatever it was that night is still out there, hungry, patient, and never far from the edge of the trees. Even now, I feel their eyes on me when I close my own, and the voice of the hooded figure echoes in my mind. They're hungry, and we're trespassing. The memory, the terror, it never fades. Every night, the shadows move a little closer, and I know it's only a matter of time before they find me again. Story, the end. It began one late September evening on a stretch of rural road that I had driven hundreds of times without incident. I was returning home from a business trip in Pennsylvania, my rental car humming along the empty highway under a sky smothered by low-hanging clouds. The sun had already disappeared beyond the tree line, leaving the road dimly lit by the occasional street lamp and the pale glow of my headlights. I remember that night clearly because there was a stillness in the air I had never noticed before. A silence so complete it seemed to swallow even the sound of my own tires on the asphalt. About an hour into my drive, I noticed a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, a rare sight in this part of the country, but something about the way it stood was off. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even seem to breathe. Its body was unnaturally still, its posture stiff, as if it were made of wood or stone. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, and realized it was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over its face. My instincts screamed at me to keep going, but then I noticed the hand. It was pointing directly toward me, flat and rigid. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding, and pressed down on the accelerator instead. As I drove past, a chill crawled up my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a shadow slip between the trees, moving impossibly fast. My pulse spiked, but I chalked it up to fatigue and the eerie atmosphere. The rest of the drive seemed uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I arrived at my apartment complex in the outskirts of Scranton, Pennsylvania, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The building I rented was an old brick structure, 3 stories tall, with narrow hallways and a faint smell of mildew that clung to the walls. It wasn't particularly unsafe, but it had a kind of oppressive atmosphere that made it feel colder than it actually was. I carried my suitcase up to the second floor, ignoring the shiver that ran down my spine as I passed the dimly lit hallway. The apartment itself was modest, but cozy. I unpacked what I could and tried to shake off the unease from the drive, convincing myself that it was just the stress of traveling. That night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It was faint like nails dragging across wood, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I froze, straining to listen, telling myself it was probably the building settling or some small animal. But then, I heard something else. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching. Each step was heavy, measured, and stopped just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out, to scream, but my throat felt constricted, like the air itself had turned to cement. The footsteps lingered for what felt like hours before finally receding, leaving only silence. I didn't sleep again that night. The following days were unsettling. Small things began to happen. Objects slightly out of place, keys left on the kitchen counter when I was sure I had set them on my desk, the faint scent of something metallic in the air. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I was tired, maybe even imagining things. But the unease kept growing, gnawing at me. One evening, I met my neighbor, an elderly man named George, who had lived in the building for decades. I asked casually if anything unusual had happened in the building, expecting a chuckle or a shake of the head. Instead, his eyes went wide, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't want to see it," he said. "You don't want to hear it. Just be careful who you let inside your apartment." I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the warning, but his expression was too serious to dismiss. Later that night, I heard it again. The scratching, the whispering, the faint sound of breathing, all coming from the hallway outside my door. I kept the door locked, clutching a baseball bat, and stayed awake until dawn. A week into living there, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open. I live on the second floor, and the window had been firmly shut the night before. Outside in the darkness, I saw a figure crouched on the fire escape, watching me. Its face was obscured, but the skin I could see glowed faintly in the moonlight, pale and almost translucent. I blinked, and it was gone. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely lock the window again. From that night onward, things escalated. The entity, or whatever it was, began appearing inside the apartment. I would wake to see shadows stretching along the walls in impossible angles, figures standing silently in corners or fleeting glimpses of something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The scratching became scratching and scraping, then pounding. The whispers formed words. My name, repeated over and over, and sometimes the name of my childhood home, or my sister, as if it had some unnatural knowledge of my life. I started recording everything, audio, video, even taking photographs at night. Reviewing the footage was terrifying. Shadows moved independently of any light source. Figures appeared blurred and distorted, faces featureless yet horrifyingly human in shape. The audio captured strange noises, growls, hissing, distorted breathing, whispers in voices that were mine and not mine all at once. I felt the walls of the apartment closing in on me, pressing down, suffocating. One night, I woke to the sensation of a hand on my shoulder. I bolted upright, but there was nothing there. My skin tingled with cold, icy fingertips, and the feeling lingered long after I turned on every light in the apartment. I began to notice patterns in the disturbances. The entity seemed to feed on fear, appearing stronger, more aggressive when I panicked or tried to fight it. Every night, the events escalated, doors slamming, windows shattering, objects flying across rooms. Desperate, I researched the building's history. It was built in 1976 on the site of an old farmhouse that had burned down in the 1920s. Several deaths had been reported over the years, some unexplained. Local legends spoke of shadows in the hallways, strange lights, and sounds of children crying. One newspaper article mentioned a tenant who disappeared without a trace, last seen leaving for work in the early morning. I began to suspect that whatever haunted me was tied to the building's past, though I couldn't understand why it had chosen me. I attempted to flee. I packed my car and drove halfway across the state, staying in a cheap motel for the night. I thought I had escaped. But when I woke in the middle of the night, I found a note slipped under the door, written in a shaky, dark red ink. "You can't hide." My blood ran cold. I locked the door, called the police, but they found nothing. Over the next several months, the presence seemed to follow me wherever I went. Shadows appeared in my apartment, motel rooms, even at my workplace. I began to lose sleep entirely, surviving on a few hours of shallow, restless rest, haunted by visions and sounds. The whispering grew more intelligible, taunting me with knowledge of my life, my habits, my fears. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered violently. I started seeing the same figure from the window outside my apartment, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs bent in unnatural ways and a featureless face. I sought help from a paranormal investigator, an older man with decades of experience. He confirmed my worst fears. The entity was attached to me, not bound to a location. It thrived on fear and isolation, patient and relentless. "Distance won't save you," he said gravely. "It's already inside your life. It's waiting, always waiting." The weeks that followed were hell. I became a recluse, barely leaving my apartment. My friends stopped calling, worried by my erratic behavior and constant anxiety. I stopped eating regularly. Shadows seemed to follow me wherever I went, and the whispering became constant, even during the day, though only I could hear it. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door slowly creaking open. The figure stood in the doorway, taller than the ceiling, limbs contorted, face smooth and featureless. It didn't move, but its presence pressed down on me like a physical weight. I could hear its voice in my head, whispering directly, intimately, promising that it would not stop, that it would never leave, that I belonged to it now. I tried everything: rituals, prayers, holy water, even moving to another city, but nothing worked. It was patient, unending, beyond the reach of normal human measures. Every night, the manifestations became more aggressive, more terrifying, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. Months turned into a year. I had lost most of my friends, my job, my social life. I could no longer leave my apartment after dark. Sleep was a distant memory. My body was failing from exhaustion, my mind fraying at the edges. The entity was always there, in the shadows, at the edge of my vision, whispering promises of despair and fear. Then one night it revealed itself fully. I awoke to a cold, suffocating presence in my bedroom. The figure, impossibly tall, limbs bent like broken branches, was standing over me. Its featureless face seemed to press into my mind, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair, a certainty that there was no escape. The air around me burned, heavy with the stench of decay and iron. I could not move, could not scream, could not breathe. It leaned down, its presence filling my entire consciousness, and whispered one final promise. You are mine. I blacked out. When I awoke, I was outside my apartment, my neighbors watching from their doors, concerned by my screams. I couldn't speak coherently. The police and paramedics found nothing physically wrong with me, but I knew the truth. It had followed me, marking me, and it would not stop. I moved again, across the country, hoping that distance would matter, but it didn't. The shadows followed. The whispers continued. I am writing this now because I have no other choice. A desperate warning to anyone who might read it. If you feel a presence behind you when you are alone, if shadows move unnaturally, if whispers call your name in the dead of night, run. Never look back. Never answer. Because once it chooses you, it will never let go. And when it comes for you fully, there will be no escape, no hiding, and no end. Story the end. It was late September when James Parker decided to take the long drive back to his hometown in rural Tennessee. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised purple, and the first whispers of autumn chilled the air. He was driving alone, the highway stretching endlessly before him, broken only by occasional gas stations and small towns that looked like they had been left behind decades ago. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a return to familiarity, a visit with family before the busy fall season began, but the road had other plans. James had always been cautious about night driving. The stories he'd heard about rural roads, people vanishing, strange lights in the woods, unexplainable accidents, were easy to dismiss, just tales told over campfires or in local diners. But that night, something felt different. The air in the truck was thick and heavy, and a low, creeping sense of dread settled over him, pressing against his chest. The first incident happened about an hour outside of Knoxville. He was passing a stretch of road lined with dense forest when a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. James slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the damp asphalt. The figure, a man, or at least it looked human at first, was standing perfectly still, almost too still. It wore a dark hooded jacket, and its face was hidden in shadows. James rolled down his window, trying to get a better look, but the man did not move. "Hey! Do you need help?" James called, his voice louder than intended, echoing across the empty road. The figure tilted its head slowly, unnaturally. And then a voice, soft but cold, carried through the air. "Don't look back." James's heart slammed against his ribs. He blinked rapidly, unsure if he had really heard it. When he looked again, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness at the edge of the forest. He swallowed hard and pressed the accelerator, refusing to glance back, but the feeling of eyes on him didn't leave. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to twist and move, and he could feel a subtle vibration in the air like something following him. The rain began soon after, light at first, then heavier, hammering the windshield and making the dark road slippery. James's anxiety increased with every mile. It was around this time that the tapping started. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, like the patter of water on metal, but as he drove, it seemed to grow louder, more deliberate. He looked around the cab of the truck. Nothing. He checked the mirrors, the bed of the truck, even the passenger seat, but there was no one there. The sound was inside, surrounding him, impossible to ignore. About 2 hours into the drive, James passed a rundown motel tucked against the edge of the forest. Its sign flickered weakly in the rain, but the parking lot was empty. Something about the place drew his eye, a sense of recognition he couldn't place. On impulse, he pulled in, thinking he might rest for a few hours. The moment he parked, he noticed a figure standing under one of the flickering lights. It was pale, unnaturally thin and featureless, with limbs that seemed too long, bent at angles that made his stomach churn. James froze. The figure's head tilted toward him, and he felt, rather than saw, awareness in that motion. It was alive in a way that didn't belong to this world. Then, without moving its feet, it began to approach the truck. James locked the doors, hands trembling on the wheel. The tapping returned, louder, resonant inside the cab. He gunned the engine and tore out of the parking lot, tires squealing on wet asphalt. The figure didn't follow in a conventional sense. He couldn't see it behind him, but James could feel it pressing into his mind, pressing into the world around him. Every shadow along the road twisted toward him. Every curve in the forest seemed to grow darker, thicker. The highway stretched on endlessly, though he knew he should have passed the next town by now. Time had become distorted, and a sense of infinite dread pressed against him from all directions. Hours, or what felt like hours. Later, James finally reached a small town, a cluster of houses and a gas station barely lit. He pulled in, relief washing over him in waves. The attendant, a young man with a vacant expression, glanced at him briefly, then turned back to the register. James tried to speak, to explain the fear gnawing at him, but his words caught in his throat. Outside, the rain had eased, but the sense of being followed remained. As he left the town, the figure appeared again. Not at the side of the road, not in the trees. It was in the lane behind him, standing in the middle of the asphalt, impossibly still, impossibly wide and tall. His headlights should have revealed it clearly, but its form was indistinct, shifting, a blur of pale shapes that defied understanding. James screamed and swerved, barely avoiding the creature, tires skidding into the ditch. He climbed out, drenched, shaking, and the figure remained in the road. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to drive him to terror. He backed up, the engine screaming, and the figure tilted its head. A whisper, like fingernails scraping across stone, cut through the rain. "You can't leave." James scrambled back into the truck and floored the accelerator, heart hammering. The road seemed endless, twisting impossibly, turning back on itself. Each mile brought more hallucinations, shadows in the trees that weren't there, distant lights that blinked off as soon as he focused on them. The tapping followed, now resonant under the floorboards in his skull, vibrating through his teeth. Eventually, he passed a bridge over a narrow creek. The rain had slowed, leaving mist curling off the water. Something flashed in the rearview mirror, a reflection, a movement, and when James looked back properly, the figure was inside the truck. It wasn't a ghostly apparition or a trick of light. It sat silently in the passenger seat, featureless, pale, and impossibly still. James's vision blurred, panic overtaking him. He swerved, tires leaving the asphalt, the truck sliding down into mud at the side of the creek. The engine died, and James was thrown forward, his body hitting the dashboard. Pain and confusion overtook him. When he came to, the truck was empty. The figure was gone. The world was silent, unnaturally silent, and the rain had stopped. James staggered out of the wreck, every instinct screaming to flee, but he didn't know which direction was safe. The road behind him twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Trees that should have been 30 feet apart seemed to close in, forming corridors of shadow. And always, the tapping followed. He wandered for hours, or maybe days. Time had no meaning, through the twisting roads and forest. Sometimes he caught glimpses of it in the corner of his vision. A pale, thin figure with elongated limbs, head tilted unnaturally, never moving normally. Each time he tried to confront it, it vanished, only to return moments later, patient, relentless. He began to hear whispers, faint at first like the wind through the trees, but gradually forming words. "Stay. Don't leave. It's yours now." James's strength began to fail. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, but the fear that gripped him was stronger than any physical need. Eventually, he stumbled upon an old farmhouse, abandoned, the windows broken, the door hanging on rusted hinges. He entered, hoping for shelter, but the house smelled of decay and something older, something that had been waiting. Shadows clung to the corners, and the tapping followed, rhythmic, insistent. In the center of the main room, a figure stood. Not the same as before, but similar. Faceless, pale limbs bent at impossible angles, and it moved in ways that defied understanding. James tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The figure raised one long, thin hand, pointing directly at him. He felt a coldness, deep and pervasive, seep into his bones. The tapping intensified, now echoing in his chest, in his head, like the rhythm of some terrible heartbeat. He tried to flee, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly, doors and hallways rearranging, trapping him in a labyrinth of shadow. Days, weeks, or perhaps months passed. Time was meaningless. The figure never left. It only watched. It whispered. It tapped. James's body grew thin, his mind fraying, but the terror never ceased. Sleep brought no reprieve, only visions of the road, the bridge, the forest, the faceless figure waiting silently, patiently. Eventually, search parties would find the truck abandoned by the creek, but James was never recovered. Locals whispered of the haunted road, of the faceless figure, of travelers who vanished after driving too far into the darkness. They warned, if you hear tapping while driving at night, do not stop. Do not look back. Some never return, some return hollow, and some are never seen again. The road remained. The figure remained, and the tapping never stopped. It followed, patient, relentless, feeding on fear, unbound by logic or distance. Travelers report strange movements in the corner of their vision, the faint rhythm of tapping underfoot, of shadows stretching unnaturally. Those who have encountered it say one thing above all: it is always waiting, always patient, always hungry. No one knows what it wants or why it chooses its victims, but it waits. And if you drive down that stretch of road late at night, the tapping begins, faint at first, then louder, echoing inside your skull, a reminder that it is there, waiting, watching, patient. And sometimes, if you are unlucky, the faceless figure rides beside you in the passenger seat, silent, unblinking, pressing into your mind, into your body, until you are gone. The road takes you. Time takes you. And it remains. The story of James Parker became another cautionary tale, another whisper along the haunted highways of America. But the road remains, the figure waits, and the tapping never ends. Travelers pass the same stretch of forest and highway, some noticing strange shadows, some hearing the insistent rhythm beneath their feet, others catching glimpses of something pale, thin, and impossibly still. The pattern repeats endlessly. No one truly escapes once it chooses you. And if you hear the tapping in the dead of night, you know already that it has begun. The figure is patient, the figure is relentless, and it waits for every one of us. Story the end. It was a cold October evening when I first realized that the road I'd been taking home for years had changed in a way I couldn't explain. I live in a rural part of Pennsylvania, a small town that stretches across wooded hills and winding back roads. Most nights, the drives are uneventful. The only sounds are the occasional animal and the hum of my car engine. But that night, around 9 o'clock, something felt off. The air itself seemed heavier, colder, and the trees lining the road swayed despite the absence of wind. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, a side effect of working late at the small factory downtown and driving home in the darkness. I had taken this same stretch of road hundreds of times before, past the old barns, the abandoned houses, and the creek that cut through the fields. But as I drove, I noticed a figure standing near one of the culverts. At first, I thought it was a man, maybe hitchhiking, but the posture was stiff, unnatural, and the way it stared at me made my stomach twist. I slowed down instinctively, and the figure raised its arm in a gesture that looked like a wave, or maybe a warning. I swallowed hard, my pulse spiking, and pressed the accelerator, eager to leave it behind. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw the shadow move. Not like a person running, but like something sliding across the field toward the road. By the time I arrived at my apartment, my hands were trembling. It was an old building, 3 stories tall, brick with narrow hallways and a lingering smell of damp wood and mildew. I had rented it because it was cheap and close to work. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the sense of being watched, telling myself that my nerves were just frayed from traveling and a long day. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a scratching sound coming from the hallway outside my door. It was faint at first, like nails dragging along wood, but persistent. I told myself it was the building settling or maybe a rat, but then came the slow, deliberate steps. Someone or something was walking past my door. I held my breath, my ears straining, and after a few minutes the footsteps stopped. Silence returned, but it felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting up in bed, clutching a baseball bat I kept under the pillow. Over the next week, the disturbances increased. Objects moved slightly when I wasn't looking. My keys vanished, only to appear on the counter in a place I would never leave them. I heard faint whispers at night, low, almost unintelligible, but sometimes I could make out my name or phrases like, "Come here," or "Look." I tried to rationalize it, maybe fatigue, stress, or paranoia, but the events were relentless. One evening, I met my neighbor, an older man named Harold, who had lived in the building for decades. I asked casually if anything strange ever happened. He looked at me like I had just asked him to step off a cliff. "You don't want to see it. You don't want to hear it. Just be careful who you let in, and don't answer when it calls." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the serious expression in his eyes made me uneasy. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and slow. I didn't answer, and the knocking stopped after a few moments, replaced by the sound of whispering that seemed to come from inside the apartment itself. The next night was worse. I woke to a cold hand brushing my shoulder. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and saw nothing. But the feeling lingered, icy fingers pressing as if something was trying to anchor itself to me. I turned on every light, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, thicker, almost moving against the light. My apartment had become a place of constant tension, a space where every creak and groan sounded amplified, sinister. I decided to install cameras around the apartment. Reviewing the footage made my blood run cold. Shadows flickered in the hallways when no one was there. A dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway on several nights, tall, with limbs bent in impossible angles, its face a featureless mask. I tried to show the footage to friends, but it was always blurred, distorted, corrupted, enough to make it seem like a technical glitch. Only I knew the truth. It was real, and it was inside my life. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke to find my bedroom window wide open. I live on the second floor, and I had locked it before going to bed. Outside on the fire escape, a figure crouched, its face pale in the moonlight, eyes hollow, watching me. I froze, and when I blinked, it was gone. My heart raced, and I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Desperate for answers, I researched the building's history. Built in the late 1970s, it had replaced an old farmhouse that burned down in the 1920s. Several unexplained deaths had occurred over the years, tenants vanishing or found dead under mysterious circumstances. Local legends spoke of shadows that moved independently, whispers in the night, and figures seen from windows that weren't really there. I began to suspect that whatever haunted me had roots in the building's past, but why it had chosen me was beyond understanding. I tried to leave, packing my car and driving hundreds of miles to stay with my sister. But the night I arrived, I found a note slipped under the motel door. "You can't hide." My blood ran cold. Police found no evidence of anyone being there, dismissed it as a prank, but I knew better. The presence followed me wherever I went. Shadows appeared at the edge of my vision, whispers called my name in empty rooms. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake for hours, eyes wide, listening to the creaking floors, to the faint movements in the walls. Objects moved on their own. A chair shifting, books sliding off shelves, doors opening and closing without wind. I contacted a paranormal investigator, a middle-aged man who had worked cases across the Northeast. He told me bluntly, "It's attached to you, not the location. Distance won't save you. It feeds on fear, isolation, and despair. It's patient. It will not stop." His words were horrifyingly accurate. The nights that followed confirmed it. Wherever I moved, whatever precautions I took, the disturbances escalated. Shadows became figures. Figures became something taller, impossibly thin, limbs twisted. Whispers became intelligible, chanting my name, recounting events from my past that no one else could know. Months passed. I stopped leaving my apartment after dark. Friends stopped calling. Work became impossible. The entities seemed to know my schedule, my habits, following me silently, haunting every moment. I tried rituals, prayers, anything to banish it, but nothing worked. I began to hallucinate, seeing it even when my eyes were closed, but hearing its whispers in every moment of silence. One night, I woke to see it fully. Standing at the foot of my bed, impossibly tall, limbs contorted like broken branches, its featureless face pressed toward me. The air was thick, suffocating. The smell of decay filled my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. It leaned closer, and in a voice that wasn't spoken but pressed directly into my mind, it whispered, "You are mine now." I blacked out. When I woke, I was outside my apartment, neighbors watching me with concern. I had no memory of how I got there. The police found no evidence of foul play, nothing unusual. But I knew the truth. It had marked me, and there would be no escape. I moved across the country, hoping distance might matter, but it didn't. It followed me, a shadow at the edges of my vision, whispering in the dead of night, feeding on my fear. Sleep remains a stranger. Shadows move in ways they shouldn't. Whispers speak my name, my habits, my life. I have lost friends, sleep, sanity. I live in constant vigilance, knowing that one day it will make full contact and there will be no escape. Every creak, every flicker of light, every shadow at the corner of my eye reminds me. It is patient, it is relentless, and it is inevitable. If you ever feel a presence behind you in an empty room, if shadows stretch in impossible ways, if whispers call your name in the silence, do not respond. Do not turn around, because once it marks you, it will not stop. You may flee, you may hide, but it will follow, patient and unending, until it finally reaches you. And when that happens, there will be nothing left. Story, the end. It was late October when Lisa Hayes decided to take the long drive from her apartment in Philadelphia back to her family's home in rural West Virginia. The sun had long since disappeared behind a thick veil of clouds, and the wind was cold, carrying the smell of damp leaves and early frost. She had driven this route dozens of times, but tonight the road felt different. Longer, narrower, and impossibly silent. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating stretches of empty forest and the occasional abandoned farmhouse, places that had always seemed normal during daylight, now twisted and unwelcoming. Lisa had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt lulling her into a trance, when she noticed a shadow flickering at the edge of the road. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and tried to dismiss it as fatigue. But the shadow moved with deliberate intent, keeping pace with her car as she drove. Her pulse quickened. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The trees lining the highway were dark and still, but the sensation of being watched clung to her like a wet coat. About 30 miles down the road, she saw it clearly. A man, standing on the shoulder, motionless. He wore a dark hood, and though the rain was light, his clothes seemed dry, untouched by the drizzle. Lisa slowed, instinctively uneasy. Something about his posture, the rigid stillness, set her nerves on edge. "Do you need a ride?" she called, her voice tighter than she intended. The figure tilted its head, unnaturally slow. Lisa noticed then that it had no discernible face, just smooth, pale skin stretched impossibly tight, the features erased. Her stomach lurched. A voice, soft and cold, carried on the wind. "Don't look behind you." Lisa's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She pressed the accelerator and drove past the figure, heart hammering. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, the man had vanished, but the unease remained, gnawing at her chest. Every shadow in the trees seemed to twist toward her. Every curve of the road darkened unnaturally. The tapping began soon after, faint at first, a rhythmic sound echoing in the cab of her car, like footsteps on wet pavement. She tried to tell herself it was the rain, or the sound of her tires in the grooves of the road, but a deep, instinctive part of her knew it was something else. The forest seemed to close in around her as the road narrowed. Rain fell harder now, soaking the windshield and making visibility almost nil. And then, a flash. Something darted across the road, impossibly fast. Lisa slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly. When she looked in the mirror, the figure was closer, standing in the middle of the lane behind her. It did not move in a conventional way. It seemed to float, its legs bending at impossible angles, arms too long, swaying slowly as if it were made of smoke and bone. Panic overtook her. She swerved, narrowly avoiding a tree, heart pounding in her ears. She glanced in the side mirror. Another figure appeared there, identical, faceless, featureless, motionless. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, and she pressed the accelerator, praying to escape. But the road twisted in ways that did not make sense. Curves appeared where none existed. Dips and rises seemed exaggerated, and the forest grew denser, closing in like a wall of shadows. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, she couldn't tell. Time seemed distorted, warped by fear and rain and the impossibility of what she saw. She spotted a dimly lit gas station ahead, relief flooding her, but as she approached, the building seemed to warp, elongate, the neon flickering like it was alive, breathing. She parked, hands trembling, and ran inside. The attendant barely looked at her as though he could see through her panic and did not care. Lisa forced herself to pay, bought a bottle of water, and rushed back to the car. As she drove away, the tapping started again, louder, insistent. It wasn't outside. It was inside the car, beneath her feet, vibrating through the steering wheel and pedals. She looked down. Nothing. She looked up. Nothing. Her heart threatened to burst from her chest. And then she saw movement in the rearview mirror, a pale, elongated figure sitting in the back seat. Her screams lodged in her throat. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. Its hands rested on the seat in front of it. impossibly long fingers curling toward her, flexing, twitching. Lisa swerved, tires hydroplaning on wet asphalt. Her vision blurred, and the road became a nightmare of twisting shadows and impossible curves. The tapping persisted, echoing in her skull. She tried to focus, tried to remember familiar landmarks, but the forest seemed endless, the highway stretching forever. She rounded a bend and saw a bridge over a creek. Mist curled from the water, obscuring the view. And then, impossibly, the figure was there again, standing in the middle of the road, watching, waiting. Lisa swerved onto the shoulder, the truck sliding down into mud. She tried to open the door, locked, tried to restart the engine. Dead. The figure approached slowly with a patience that made her stomach turn. It raised one thin hand, fingers twitching unnaturally. The tapping crescendoed inside her skull, resonant like some terrible heartbeat. Lisa felt the cold press of something ancient and malevolent against her mind, crushing, omnipresent. She screamed, body shaking uncontrollably, but the sound was swallowed by the night. And then she blacked out. When she awoke, she was alone. The car was a mangled wreck, rain pouring over it. The forest around her was silent, almost unreal, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. She staggered out of the truck, heart still hammering. Time had no meaning. The world seemed wrong. Shadows moved unnaturally, curling along the tree line, twisting toward her, and always the tapping followed, rhythmic, deliberate, omnipresent. She wandered for hours, maybe days. Hunger and thirst gnawed at her, but fear kept her moving. Every corner, every tree, every shadow seemed to harbor the faceless figures, waiting patiently, silently, watching. They didn't chase her, didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to drive her to madness. Eventually, she stumbled upon an old farmhouse, abandoned, broken windows and splintered doors. Inside, shadows clung to corners like living things. One of the figures stood in the center of the room, featureless, pale, elongated limbs bent in ways that should have been impossible. Lisa tried to speak, but her voice failed. The figure raised a long, thin hand, pointing at her. A coldness seeped into her bones, deep and pervasive, a force that pressed into her very soul. Days, weeks, or months passed. Lisa never slept without visions of the road, the forest, the faceless figures, the relentless tapping. Time had no meaning. Her body grew thin, her mind fraying, but the terror never ceased. She became a shadow of herself, wandering, trapped, haunted, consumed. Search parties eventually found her car, abandoned near the creek, but Lisa was never recovered. Locals whispered of the haunted highway, of travelers who vanished after night drives, of pale, faceless figures appearing on dark roads. They warned, if you hear tapping while driving at night, do not stop, do not look back. Some never return, some come back hollow, some are gone forever. The road remains, the figures remain, and the tapping never stops. It follows travelers, patient and relentless, feeding on fear, unbound by logic or distance. Those who encounter it report strange shadows in the corner of their vision, whispers carried on the wind, glimpses of something pale, thin, and impossibly still. No one knows why it chooses its victims. No one knows what it wants. But it waits, patient, watching, unrelenting. And if you hear the tapping in the dead of night, know this: it has already begun. Story the end.